So first of all, just short contextualization that this is a product of many years of working with Hannah Arendt that I really started to appreciate by translating it and giving scissors what scissors, thanks to a public thanks to Vlasta for coaching my first translation of Arendt 10 years ago on violence. Then we co-edited and co-translated on revolution, and I hope we will translate eventually The Life of the Mind. This link between Arendt and Hegel was an idea that I got in a 2-year seminar we got on Hegel's philosophy, on reading Hegel's philosophy of right, where we try to extrapolate a certain political theory out of Hegel, Arendtian political theory out of Hegel. And the last context I should give you, I think, is that this paper is made inside the institutional framework of, on the one hand, the project of 2 projects I'm working currently on. The one hand, Vlasta's project on the breaking tradition, and on the other, another project on Hegel and Shakespeare theater of power. So that's why this title and why I try to think the issue of action via Arendt, Hegel, and Shakespeare. So my question, and to make a follow-up of what Vlasta said on Wednesday, is not only was Arendt a Hegelian, which I would agree that she was, but also was Hegel an Arendtian, and were both of them Shakespearean, and all the 3 of them Homerian. And this is the first author I would like to start with. That's Homer. So the poet of the Iliad and the Odyssey was, as it is well known, and leaving the Homeric question aside, not only not just a poet, but rather the poet, and also as Plato, this poet among philosophers, as Nietzsche baptized him, says in Homer's regard, in his Politeia, in his The Republic, the English mistranslation is indicative in this sense, the one who provided the education, paideia, of Greece. That's a quote by Plato. And despite taking the side of Socrates in the old quarrel between philosophy and poetry against those who think that in the management and education of human affairs, it is worthwhile to take him up for study and for living by arranging one's whole life according to this poet, namely Homer, Plato nevertheless admits that Homer indeed educated Greece, and moreover that he is the most poetic and first of the tragic poets. Homer, as we can see, plays a lot of roles at once. First, he's the poet of the first Greek epics and therefore also European epics. He is the most poetic and first tragic poet, and the one who brought education to Greece, and therefore a practical man of wisdom, sophos, and also philosopher, philosophos. At least since a period of time, both terms were used synonymously until the relatively new quarrel between philosophers and sophists arise, championed by, of course, Plato and Aristotle against Gorgias and the Sicilian school of rhetorics, as we all know. However, if there is one point and a verse in Homer's epics where all of this combine, condense, and clearly show the link between politics, philosophy, and theater, then it's the famous lines describing what is the purpose of education, or what was the purpose of education before this COVID pandemic, in the case of Achilles, to make him miton territori emenai practiora tergon, a speaker, rhetori, literally orator of words, miton, memorable words, not logia, miton, so memorable words, and at the same time a doer, practira, practitioner of deeds, ergon, works. However, in order for words and deeds to become worth of remembrance, an assembly is needed, and that's the role of the assembly inside the Iliad and the Odyssey is a topic per se, but let me just stress you what's necessary for this paper to go on, let's say. Ecclesia, a gathering of those summoned, the lexical definition of ecclesia, a public space where these words and deeds can be heard and seen and consequently remembered. In this context, an important political note must be made, namely that an assembly provides a public space for deeds and words to be heard and seen independently of any war being waged or not. Or to put it bluntly, a war cannot be waged without an assembly where strategy is discussed and decided, while an assembly can very well also be, and indeed is, called during times of peace. which both the Iliad and the Odyssey demonstrate, as the first is an epic of war, the other of peace. As scholars of Arendt, you of course know the relevance of this passage for her thought. For in the, at least in the Between Past and Future, she uses recurrently these verses about Achilles, however translated in a slightly different manner. She says, the doer of great deeds and the speaker of great words, reversing the Homeric line and putting the deeds before the words, which is indicative of the way how Arendt thinks, and Homer especially. And redoubling the adjective great, of great deeds and great words. She uses regularly this line in order to show how the public space of politics is something that is made of political actions and speeches. As for instance, in the following one from the concept of history, where she makes some reflections on the distinction between praxis and poiesis, and then concludes that implied in them, however, is one great and painful paradox which contributed to the tragic aspect of Greek culture in its greatest manifestations. The paradox is that, on the one hand, she continues, everything was seen and measured against the background of the things that are forever, while on the other, true human greatness was understood, at least by pre-Platonic Greeks, to recite in deeds and words, and was rather represented by Achilles, the doer of great deeds and speaker of great works, than by the maker and fabricator, even the poet and writer. This paradox, that greatness was understood in terms of permanence, while human greatness was seen in precisely the most futile and less lasting activities of man, has haunted Greek poetry and historiography as it has perturbed the quiet of the philosophers. This is a quote from Between Past and Future on the concept of history. Political actions, therefore, and speeches, in contrast to violence and violent actions, as the exact opposite, discernible, for instance, also in this passage, from On Violence, where she says that the idea of man creating himself is strictly in the tradition of Hegelian and Marxian thinking, and that it is the very basis of all leftist humanism. But if, according to Hegel, man produces himself through thought, for Marx, who turned Hegel's idealism upside down, it was labor, and although one might argue that all notions of man creating himself have in common a rebellion against the very faculty of human condition, still nothing is more obvious than that man does not owe his existence to himself, and therefore that what Sartre, Marx, and Hegel have in common is more relevant than the particular activities through which this non-fact should be presumably have come about. Nevertheless, she concludes at the end of this quite lengthy passage, it cannot be denied that a gulf separates the essential peaceful activities of thinking and laboring from all deeds of violence, and thus also between violence and power, which springs up whenever people get together and act in concert, but derives its legitimacy from the initial getting together rather than from any action then may follow. What I want to stress out is that inside her theory of action, she distinguishes these actions that are made of great speeches and great deeds from actions of violence or violent actions. I will get back to this in a few bits. On the other hand, now we have getting back to the same Homeric reference of Achilles, we have Hegel, in whose work Achilles does not figure as prominently as in Arendt's, but the Greeks, of course, do. Both in the history of philosophy as well in the philosophy of history, he recurrently says that among the Greeks we feel ourselves immediately at home because the Greeks were at home in the world. So we feel at home with the Greeks because the Greeks were at home in the world. And he adds, because with them we are in the region of spirit. Moreover, in the philosophy of history, he says that Greece presents to us the cheerful aspect of youthful freshness, of spiritual vitality. It is here first that advancing spirit makes itself the content of its volition and its knowledge, but in such a way that state, family, law, religion are at the same time objects aimed at by individually, while the latter is individuality only in virtue of those aims. The full-grown man, on the other hand, devotes his life to labor for an objective aim, which he pursues consistently, even at the cost of his own individuality. And the two embodiments of such a stance are precisely, at least for Hegel, Achilles and his great admirer, Alexander the Great, the one of the youthful part of the youthful Greeks, and Alexander as the grown man part of these youthful Greek spirits, where like it's Sittlichkeit, the ethic Sittlichkeit of Greece is precisely this combining of individual and collective, if you will, that the action of an individual have meaning only as long as it has a collective meaning, and vice versa, the collectivity exists only if there is an individual to uphold it, in striking contrast to modernity. Now, finally, Shakespeare, as the third author who addresses the same issue in Homer, Shakespeare reworked many of a mythological history from antiquity at large, for obvious reasons, mostly preferring Roman history, Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, and so on, since it did not reflect itself, the Roman culture did not reflect itself in the same way as the Greeks did with their great tragedies, such as Aeschylus, the triad of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, who dealt either with pure mythology, like the Prometheus Bound by Aeschylus, or history, such as the work Persians. Shakespeare now portrayed, it's interesting to know that he portrayed Achilles only once, where he makes an appearance as a minor character in his tragedy, or rather tragicomic questioning of the impossibility of conventional tragedy, as Oates puts it. So his tragicomic Troilus and Cressida, where Achilles is mocked during the dialogue between, I mean, on many instances, but this one is, I think, the best one. He's mocked in the dialogue between Cressida and Pandarus for the same reasons, almost the same reasons he is exalted in Homer. Cressida says, "There is among the Greeks Achilles, a better man than Troilus." Pandarus replies, "Achilles, a drayman, a porter, a very camel." Cressida, "Well, well." Pandarus, "Well, well. Why have you any discretion? I have you in any eyes. Do you know what a man is? Is not birth, beauty, good shape, discourse, manhood, learning, gentleness, virtue, youth, liberality, and such like, the spice and salt that season a man?" And Cressida replied, "Ay, a minced man, and then to be baked with no date in the pie, for then the man's date's out." Now, on the other hand, Achilles himself does not refrain from mocking them back, but not as a man of action, but rather as Homer in his Iliad and his followers from the epic cycle, glorifying his sacred anger, will it, as a man of inaction, as a man of unaction, which has, however, massive political consequences, since his refrain from fighting produces more violence than his return to battle does. In the same play by Shakespeare, Ulysses, king of Ithaca, who can be regarded as Achilles' double due to his use of logos, wits, and tricks instead of via, strength, and violence, in answer to Agamemnon's question of what is the remedy to the nature of the sickness found, says the following: "The great Achilles, whom opinion crowns the sin away and the forehand of our host, having his ear full of his airy fame, grows dainty of his worth, and in his tent lies mocking our designs." Now, the Iliad, as we all know, begins with Achilles' anger, his sacred rage, menace in the Greek original, a word with Indo-European roots that links it with both with the old Iranian Avesta, a collection of sacred Zoroastrian writings, and old Hindu Bhagavad Gita, part of the Mahabharata epic poem, to the sacred rage of the gods, so that the topic of all the epics in India, Iran, and Greece is the same, the sacred rage, which can be invoked, at least in the Homeric tradition, by humans too, especially if they are demigods as Achilles is, but the cost to pay is nothing less than life. Moreover, it consists not only of the, let's say, more psychological aspect of anger, dealt with especially well in tragedy on the stage with actors performing its psychological manifestation, but has also a metaphysical dimension in the sense that it pertains to the sacred, an enlarged anger, so to speak, since the gods are part of it too. While its political precondition is that it must be politically legitimate in order to be invoked. So no arbitrary, individual, capricious character is involved. This is a later reworking Homer is very coherent about this, but later reworkings like the one I quoted about of Shakespeare's show like that Achilles is capricious, and that's why he does not fight. That's why he invokes menace as inaction in order to produce violence upon his fellow Greeks. And most importantly for our discussion, Achilles' anger manifests its peculiarity in the form of this inaction that I mentioned, of his withdrawal from the affairs of man and transition into the realm of gods, to the divine realm, so to speak, together with all the consequences, political and violent, that follow in the aftermath. Now, I'm doing this long detour because both Arendt and Hegel took this issue at heart, considering inaction, the lack of action, if you will, as pertaining to action, as an essential part of action, both in terms of direct effects as well as responsibility for the consequences of inaction. Think only of the distinction between guilt and responsibility of those German citizens that did nothing during Nazi Germany, that is discussed at length in Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism on the one hand, or even more strikingly, her conclusion of the Praxis chapter in the Vita Activa, with the Latin words attributed to Cato, numquam se plus agere quam nihil cum ageret, numquam minus solum esse quam cum solus esset. And consider, on the other hand, Hegel's dealing with the figure of the beautiful soul that does not want to get dirty with worldly affairs in the phenomenology of the spirit, or his insisting on the legal responsibility of a person that does not help a fellow citizen in need, in a, for instance, life-threatening situation, as he discussed it in the Philosophy of Right. I'm dealing in length with this negative of action, namely lack of action, inaction, in order to show that Arendt and Hegel have a very defined understanding of action that includes even its lack as its essential part, while still, however, and this will now be my main point, lacking a theoretically coherent definition of action. Action is, as we have seen via Homer, central to our two authors of preference, but surprisingly what both lack is a coherent theory of action. Arendt speaks of human, political, violent, individual, collective action, almost indiscriminately, even in chapters or books that are dedicated entirely to the issue, like the Praxis chapter of the before-mentioned Vita Activa, also known as Human Condition, where action in general is opposed to ponos, works as labor, and poesis, artistic creation. While the best that Hegel produces is the distinction between Tat and Handlung from his philosophy of right. Even more surprisingly, the author to whom one needs to turn in order to get a more defined definition of action in terms of action itself, not in terms of differences to other human phenomena like power or violence, is Shakespeare. That will be, I'm moving slowly to the conclusion. I have one part dedicated to Arendt, the other to Hegel, and the last one to Shakespeare. So first, Arendt, I will go very rapidly through here because I assume that you all know the references I will be mentioning. So Hannah Arendt in the Vita Activa, in the Human Condition, defines Vita Activa as active life in contrast to the Vita Contemplativa as contemplative life, already discernible from the Latin wordings that is this distinction is more Roman than Greek in its character, opposing, to put it bluntly, theory to action. Nevertheless, she of course at least starts by dealing with the old Aristotelian definition of the three modes of living from Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethic. One is devoted to pleasure, bios hedone, the other to politics, bios politikos, and the third one to theory, bios theoretikos. The main opposition being between politics and philosophy, as discernible from the later recapitulation of the same issue in Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethic. Now, since Aristotle's analysis is actually a copy of Plato's, dealing with the same or rather similar subject in the dialogue Philebus, where Plato distinguishes only between a life devoted to pleasure and a life devoted to thinking, while curiously enough opting for a mixture of both, since either of the first two are, according to Plato, impossible in themselves. From here on, and keeping this in mind, is obvious why Arendt was, of course, more interested in Aristotle than Plato, and how it is precisely this insistence on action that she reads, or at least understands, Aristotle together with Hegel, about whom she said, no philosophy is from antiquity onward, looked upon the human affairs in such a way. All the references I have aren't on Hegel. I got from Vlasta's lecture on Arendt and Hegel in Ljubljana, and her article in German that I sadly cannot read properly since my German is even worse than my English. But I will skip those one. You heard Vlasta's paper on Wednesday. I think the references are enough. For my part, it's important to know that Arendt's innovation in regard to both Aristotle and Hegel was adding a critique of Marx to the mixture, since for her a life devoted to political action differs from a life of labor, Arbeit, that produces products through which one overcomes the necessity of living, and the creation of works of art, Werke, that are formed as enduring monuments beyond the necessity of everyday life on the other. Thus, the main and most important conceptualization that she provides is the distinction between labor, ponos in Greek, creation, poiesis, and action, praxis, the latter being the only one that is an end in itself, as she says, while the others two are both means to an end, overcoming mortality and achieving immortality, to put it bluntly. Now, on the other hand, Hegel, who also follows Aristotle, this time not in differing action from theory, this distinction is, according to him, made by those who have an interest in affirming either action against theory or theory against action, but rather by making a distinction inside action itself. Aristotle says in book 3 of his Nicomachean Ethics that as nobody can catch a stone once it is thrown, so nobody can say about his or her action, this is not mine, or I would have done it differently once it's done. Since, Aristotle says, the stone was in his or her hand to be thrown or not. The arche of the action was in him. Arche meaning cause, reason, and beginning at the same time. Thus also defining more broadly the character of ethics of a man simply as his or her repetitive action that started somewhere, sometime, and caused someone to become as he or her, we could add, is now. Now, Hegel Christianized, so to speak, this Greek example by first quoting the old German saying that the stone belongs to the devil once it is thrown in the paragraph 119 of his Philosophy of Right, while at the same time enlarge Aristotle's definition of free action by excluding women and slaves from the list of those unable to act freely, leaving children, imbeciles, and lunatics, quoting Hegel, since slaves were abolished in this time, or rather transformed into workers, and women were already regarded as possessing the ability to think freely. That's historically cultural context in which Hegel modernizes Aristotle. Apart from these cultural and historical curiosities, and the difference is the results of Hegel's inquiry is very similar to Aristotle's. What does Hegel say? He says, was das Subjekt ist die Reihe seiner Handlungen. What the subject is the series of his own action. Or more prosaically speaking, by redacting the translation, the subject is the series of its own actions. So very similar definition as in Aristotle's Ethics. Hegel, however, brought also something new to the table that neither Aristotle could think and Arendt did not explicitly write about, but I think it's implicit in her own theory. Namely, the distinction between Tat and Handlung, between deed and action. An action has, Hegel says, multiple consequences insofar as it is translated into external existence, Dasein. These consequences, as the outward shape whose soul is the end to which the action is directed, says Hegel, belong to the action as integral part of it. Thus, action is exposed to external forces which attach to it things quite different from what is it for itself and impel it on into remote and alien consequences, thus transforming necessity into contingency and vice versa. So that from this point of view, Hegel says, to act, therefore, means to submit oneself to this law of necessity and contingency. And this contingency is precisely the reason why there is always already a tragic moment attached to action, a moment that neither Hegel nor Arendt failed to address, as Alan Speit, among others, brilliantly demonstrated in his article entitled Arendt and Hegel on the tragic nature of action. As far as the subject acts, it must take upon himself or herself the fact that his or her action can have a completely different outcome than the one intended, even a genuinely tragic one. And the prototype that Hegel mentions in the note to the above quoted paragraph 118 for such a case of tragic hero in action is none other than Oedipus, who killed a stranger on a crossroad, solved the Sphinx riddle, become the Theban king, married its queen, only to find out that it was his father whom he killed and his mother whom he married. This is the point where Hegel draws the line between purpose as Absicht and purpose as Vorsatz, in the sense of intention. Intention pertains only to the particularity of a freely willed deed, while purpose includes also its unpredictable consequences. So that Oedipus' intention may well have not been to fulfill Freud's wettest dreams about killing his own father and having sex with his mother, but this was for sure his purpose. And hence Hegel's critique of the heroic self-consciousness which he speaks about, which has not yet progressed from its unalloyed simplicity to reflect on the distinction between deed, Tat, and action, Handlung, between the external event and the purpose and knowledge of the circumstances, or to analyze the consequences minutely, but accepts responsibility for the deeds in its entirely. And this is why Konstantin Sandins could entitle the article on Hegel's theory of action ingeniously as the man who mistook his Handlung for a Tat, Hegel and Oedipus and other tragic Thebans. I mean, this is one of the most brilliant titles one can give to an article. The man who mistook his Handlung for a Tat, that's Oedipus. That's the tragic hero. Now, one last final effort remains. I think I have 4 more minutes, if I'm not mistaken, namely Shakespeare, who in his Hamlet elaborated this Hegelian distinction between deed and action even further. Being even more Hegelian and more Arendtian than Hegel and Arendt herself and himself. In the famous comic relief scene of the Hamlet, the 2 clowns on the graveyard, on the churchyard, okay, by the Didascalia, just before the very last scene of the tragedy, we encounter this humorous dialogue regarding a most delicate issue, the issue of Ophelia's suicide, and whether she deserves a Christian burial or not. So this is the first scene of Act 5. The first clown says, "Is she to be buried in Christian burial that willfully seeks her own salvation?" The second clown replies, "I tell thee she is, and therefore make her grave straight. The crown her head set on her and find its Christian burial." The first clown replies again, "How can that be, unless she drowned herself in her own defense?" So she did suicide in her own defense. The second clown, "Why, it is found so." The first clown now explains, "It must be self-endendo. It cannot be else. For here lies the point," which is also the point of my paper. "If I drown myself wittingly, it argues an act. And an act had 3 branches. It is to act, to do, and to perform. Argal, she drowned herself wittingly, not willingly, wittingly." Action is here by Shakespeare defined as having 3 branches, therefore. Action, deed, and performance, from which one can extrapolate, so to speak, 3 subjects: an actor, a doer, and a performer, pertaining to the 3 different realms of theater, philosophy, and politics. Shakespeare, thinking as a theater worker, first starts not with the noun action, but rather with the verb to act, but proceeds in a very Hegelian manner, I would like to argue, to repeat or redouble it, as if the genus of the action encounters first itself as its own species in order to dialectically produce the other 2, the to-do of the doer and the perform of the performer. So Shakespeare says it argues an act, and an act has 3 branches: to act, that's the repetition of the act, to do, and to perform, the other 2. The dialectics here employed understand action encompassed in the universal to act, the first to act before the 3 branches, as composed of what Hegel labeled Handlung or action, but adding to the singular, particular thought or deed a third moment, namely that of the performance, which is, I would like to argue, an eminently political category, since it is the only one that includes the other two. On a short note, that's why also performance is much broader than the theater performance. That's why we say a theater performance, not a, I don't know, street artistic performance, or even, as I would like to argue, a political performance. And here we have it. If there is a theory or definition of action that can be drawn by linking Arendt, Hegel, and Shakespeare, with Homer in the background, then it's this. The intersubjective dimension is the prerequisite of any political action, which is thus essentially an interaction, as we heard many times during this conference, during this week, a situation where a group of people get and act together, as Arendt puts it, and where there is no difference between acting subjects as pertaining to the theater, where the actors are on stage and the public is seated, or as with philosophy, where we have the reverse situation, where there is only the thinking I that always already differs from the others, but rather we have a collective of interplay between all of these, as Hegel articulates this most clearly while discussing the French Revolution in his phenomenology of the spirit, the political and at the same time theatrical event par excellence. The acting subject, once we reach the position of spirit and when history invades and so on, we reach the position where an I who is a we and a we who is an I. So where there is no difference between individual singular person and the collective. And maybe I'm overstretching theory into theater, theater into politics, politics into philosophy, and back on stage again, I don't know. But I do know that I must now most definitely overstepping my time limit if I want to have a discussion too, and therefore think that this is not perhaps a bad time to conclude this performance too. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mirt. I enjoyed immensely. I mean, this last part was really very impressive. So who wants to talk? Zoom participants.
Zoom wants to talk.
Zoom, do you want to talk?
Don't encourage him, otherwise he will start to speak.
Okay, Ringo wants to talk, definitely.
I'm totally agree with
just a moment, just a second. Okay. Who else from the Zoom? Okay, maybe you'll want to talk later. Here. Okay, I have a question, but I will put it, I mean, I will also ask a question, but if anybody else would want to talk before me, then, you know, you just talk. So it's Ringo.
Thank you. This was stunning in the end. Yes, I'm totally agree with you. And the relationship between action, deed, and performance. I think it's very important to have a look on the performance aspect on everything in Arendt, because it also contains the two sides of a spectator and an actor. I would go. I only have one question. You said a couple of minutes ago that you think a philosopher is a doer. What does that mean?
No.
No? Okay. Maybe I misunderstand you.
When I branched the two, an actor, doer, and performer, you mean?
Yes.
Can I answer the question as they come? I found, first of all, most of the interpretation of the French Revolution go in the direction that the French revolutionaries themselves already used. So the French revolutionaries themselves spoke in terms of theater while reflecting their own actions, and historians and political theorists tend to reproduce this understanding. The two authors I found, of course, exceptional in this regard was Arendt and Hegel. Arendt, due to her work on the revolution, where she tried to go, let's say, against the mainstream interpretations by showing by not being fascinated by the moment of violence, to put it bluntly, and Hegel by the quote I used that if there was a political moment in the French Revolution was precisely this merging of individual and collective, and that the spectators of whom one can speak is were the Germans. I'm pointing to the brilliant book by Rebecca Komel, Morning Sickness, Hegel and the French Revolution, where the whole book is constructed against this relationship between France and Germany, French revolutionaries on the one hand and German idealism on the other. Now this triad, I must confess, I worked it the whole week in my head, how to make it work, this to do, to act, to do, and to perform, and how to squeeze philosophy inside. Why is a philosopher a doer? I cannot give you yet an answer. I need to think this more through. But you're pointing, I have a half idea, but I will not now guess and try to develop a half idea publicly, if you will. But it is a neuralgic point. I'm trying to think inside this. So the very ending part, it was the most experimental one, the part I'm most unsure about. So yeah, you heard the right problem.
Okay. Yeah, if there is no one else, I would like to maybe make a comment. I'm sorry that, I mean, I sense that there is a relation between what you've talked. I don't know whether you've been listening to our discussions and carols about, you know, what is political action and who acts and who's the agent and agency, etc. Because I think that what you have been talking about relates to that, but I don't want to tackle this now because Tony is unfortunately not here. I would like him to hear, but you know, since he cannot speak, we cannot tackle this. What I would suggest, that's just a suggestion to what Ringo and you have been discussing, is that maybe a philosopher's way of acting is in, as Arendt would say, in dark times, when they can speak the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So she says there is the only way where truth can, let's say, become political issue is in those times where, you know, we are faced with the situation of organized lying in politics, and when the distinction between truth and lies is blurred, so that we don't move anymore on the territory of facts. And then she says, you know, then if philosophers start speaking the truth, he is in fact acting and not thinking anymore. So he moves. And she is also, this is how she criticizes Marx, you know, this, his implementation of Hegel, where she says it's Marx, what I talked last time, it's Marx who made a step further, yeah, with implementing this in so to say, in practice, the philosophers' imagination of, you know, how things should be done. And she says the only thing, I think, you know, where philosopher can become political in this sense is when he speaks the truth, when the truth is not there anymore in this sense. So, but this would be my comment, and my question would be, since you were talking, you know, about this relationships between, I would say, if I simplify very much, between art and politics, and there is, you know, these three things, these three aspects of action that you so brilliantly developed at the end, which I really liked very much. So thank you. But what do you think, you know, what would you say if I would, you know, like bluntly said, you know, ask a question like, you know, when is art political then, you know, and what is about that is artists artist on the politic itself. So Arendt speaks about a theater as about the most, something that is within the arts, most related to politics, basically. So she speaks about this performative aspect of art. So, you know, when do you think is art political? Because we are, I think, moving, and that is my comment, very much in the age of where we are almost there, where Arendt says at the end of Vita Activa, of the on human condition, when she speaks about, you know, this replacement of substitution of politics, substitution of action with other things. So now she speaks about, like, you know, Hegel substitutes action by the end with history. So he discovered, you know, he starts with this wonderful, you know, being, non-being, beginning. He shows, you know, that who is the beginner really, and then he substitutes it, and that's her major major criticism of Hegel. Basically, he substitutes this again with history. So, and then she says at the end of the human condition, she says, maybe we are already in times where there'll be only scientists, she says, and artists who will be able to act, and no one else. So it's very pessimistic way of concluding. So are we already there? So, you know, because sometimes, you know, we you know, we did public space, which is basically, you know, performative space. We are online, you know, everything, we show ourselves with our nice images, etc., which is, I mean, a public, you know, that is important for this division, but still, you know, it is a kind of images that we show. So are we already there? Maybe, you know, what is political about art nowadays?
Yeah, thank you for this reflection. And on the I don't know if, I mean, the year is somehow confirming Arendt's pessimism that we entered in 2020 into an unhuman condition of being, where scientists and artists will be the only one doing, I mean, able to act in these conditions. I think it's showing, let's say, a certain transformation of the public space now, that we see that we have a proliferation of, and I'm addressing both your questions, which imply a certain thesis that I agree with. So the task of philosophy is to speak the truth in this post-truth era, but to speak the truth, he needs a public space. So it's not enough to find the truth. So let's say one must be able to speak it aloud in presence of other fellow human beings. And on the other, the politicity of art, I think it has the same political precondition, that it needs a public space. What we are witnessing nowadays is precisely the opposite, this unhuman condition that more and more social media and digital way of pseudo-communicating are proliferating, and that we are like, you know, artificially flipping the coin, like putting a bandage on a wound that was already there with modernity, but that it shows that it doesn't work, at least by my advice. Because on the other hand, what is the most damagingly political aspect of this pandemic is, I think, the elementary prohibition of gathering people together. The getting together, the very basic action of getting together as the precondition of any politics possible is the most dangerous and damaging thing in this aspect. So the task of philosophy and task of art here is the same. So speak and perform this getting together, this physical getting together, this allowing the creation of a public space that now truly disappeared.
Okay, so if you finish there is one more question. I would just make one remark. Isn't it interesting, you know, that for example, in Slovenia, we have this case where, you know, public gatherings where artists and, you know, where art and theater and concerts, etc., are so restricted. So under such, and also, you know, our gathering here was put under this really strict observation if we stick to the rules, etc. On the other hand, you know, we have people who in the pubs can just gather and there is basically no problem. And we've seen these discussions. So how, you know, how this affects us. This is just a remark, an observation, you know, of that, you know, where are we moving? But Martin wants to say something right now. So, and we still have like 10 minutes left if we want to.
Well, Vlasta has basically stolen my question, so no, but I wanted to say it was really lovely to listen to your presentation and reminded me that both, it reminded me also of Lana's presentation and this interesting, this point, this intersection between Arendt, ancient Greece, that is theater, and Rancière, where I think that in Human Condition, Arendt says that theater was very much political in ancient Greece because it was part of the public space, and public space in ancient Greece was political. And that reminds me to the current situation in Slovenia and also the United States, but I want to stick to Slovenia, where the lockdown has not prevented public gathering in the sense of civil disobedience, which was mainly instigated by, like Lasa has pointed out, by artists, and show that, you know, we are here, this is political action produced or enacted by mainly artists who perform in that sense. So this is more like a remark, you know.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. About the why was the theater political in Greece? One case in history was in the times of the peak of Athenian democracy. I think it's noteworthy that the ecclesia, the assembly in Athens, first gathered in the Pnyx, so in an, let's say, natural open air theater where they gathered, but at the peak of democracy with 35 to 40,000 people gathering together discussing the future of the polis, Pericles was the one who suggested that this assembly should move to the Dionysus theater on the just below the Acropolis. So I think this move is very interesting.
That's
Why?
a good idea.
Yeah, exactly. Because it was also my suggestion.
Please, yeah, you tell it. Yeah, that's excellent.
I'm repeating this suggestion from meeting to meeting. Also yesterday we had, I'm sorry, yesterday I couldn't attend. We had an extraordinary meeting because I'm chief of the department at the Cultural Studies department at my Faculty of Social Sciences, and I had to, you know, I'm managing the COVID scholarly year, and they are, you know, discussing how many people can be in one classroom and my suggestion, recurrent for 2 weeks now, is that we should build with construction material, which is very cheap, you know, the material they do when they do building facades or similar, that in front of the faculty should construct a Greek amphitheater so we can have lecture outside with no people limit. And I think first they laughed it in the first week of September, but now more time I'm repeating and lobbying in on coffee breaks and similar, more the people are starting taking it seriously, that it's really I mean,
let's move to the stadium with mics, you know, and we are sitting all around, you know, and, you know, we can keep distance and we can talk. So sports, cultural, you know, buildings, etc. We just occupy them with politics.
In Ljubljana, there is this beautiful abandoned stadium, which has accidentally also a Greek stoa in front of Plečnikov, you know?
Plečnikov Stadium, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
We can use for educational purposes and corporate purposes and so on. I mean, where there is will, there is power, or how the saying goes.
But
okay, just short.
I remember in 2013 where there were huge protests against government. Public assemblies, or at least one that I participated in, took place in Sankharya Dome. So in a theater, actually, we had a public assembly of what should be done, how to act, which is, you know, one way of saying, like, you know, this is how theater can also be political, not just like for escapism.
Okay, we still have 5 minutes. If there is any urgent comment, or if Mirt wants to say something short for the conclusion.
What is wrong with escapism? As Vladimir Nabokov says, the ivory tower is very nice if you have a lot of books in it, and if you have an elevator to go down to buy the newspaper and get friends up to discuss interesting things.
Okay.
Now, what makes it precisely this public political life, no, that is missing.